You'll take off one thing for every wrong answer. His voice was calm, steady, but there was a predatory undertone that froze me in place. I couldn't speak, couldn't react, just sat there, stunned. It's just one rule, Adele. If you want to keep playing, you have to accept it. How did I even end up here? I sat on the edge of the couch, the soft hum of the AC the only sound in the room. The house was dark except for the dim glow of the lamp by his chair. My mom's husband, Richard, leaned back, a glass of wine in one hand, a deck of cards in the other. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes never left me. It all started innocently enough, or so I thought. My mom had asked me to stay home with Richard while she worked late. Keep him company, she said with a laugh, clearly thinking nothing of it. But the moment she left, the air in the house changed. I have something fun we could do, Richard had said casually, like it was the most normal thing in the world. He reached for a small box on the shelf and placed it on the table in front of me. I've created a game. His voice was so calm, so inviting, it almost masked the tension simmering beneath the surface. It's not your average card game. It's about trust, pushing boundaries. But don't worry, you can stop anytime. I should have walked away then, but something about his tone, about the way he spoke, made it impossible. I felt like he was testing me. I didn't want to back down. All right, I said, sitting straighter. Let's see this game. Richard smiled, a slow, knowing smile. He shuffled the deck with practiced ease, and I watched as he placed the cards on the table. Each card had handwritten prompts scrawled across them in bold, black ink. It's simple, he explained, his eyes locked on mine. Each card is a challenge or a question. You either answer honestly or you do what it says. Refuse both, and the game ends. My stomach flipped, but I didn't let it show. I reached for the first card, my fingers trembling slightly. It was a question, nothing too intense, just personal enough to make me uncomfortable. I answered, my voice steady, but my pulse racing. Each card after that pushed me further, asked things I never thought I'd say out loud. And just when I thought I could manage it, he added the rule. One mistake, and you take something off. That's the rule. His words hung in the air like a challenge. My instincts screamed at me to stop, but his calm, unwavering gaze made it impossible to back down. It's just a game, I whispered to myself, trying to steady the storm raging in my chest. But deep down, I knew this was no ordinary game. My mind was tearing itself apart, caught between the urge to leave and the strange curiosity that kept me rooted in place. Just one game, I told myself. No more roles. But deep down, I knew better. This was only the beginning. Richard had a way of making every word sound like a challenge, every glance a calculated move to keep me off balance. I could feel it now, his mastery of manipulation. It wasn't what he said outright, but how he said it. Every word, every pause, was designed to make me feel like I was in control. What happens if I refuse? I asked, more to stall for time than to hear his answer. His expression didn't change. Then the game ends. That should have been enough for me to walk away, but his tone carried something else, something unsaid. He didn't have to say it. I knew this wasn't the kind of game you just walked away from without consequences. I reached for the next card, my hand trembling slightly as I picked it up. Your darkest secret, I read aloud, my throat tightening as my pulse quickened. My mind raced. My darkest secret? There was no way I could answer that, not honestly, anyway. But if I didn't, what then? His eyes were on me, calm yet unrelenting, and I could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on me. Come on, Adele, he said, his smile barely reaching his eyes. It's just a game. But it wasn't just a game. Not anymore. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak, but the words that came out weren't the truth. Not the truth he was looking for, anyway. I told him something safe, something far enough from the mark that it couldn't hurt me. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he smiled, that same unreadable smile that sent shivers down my spine. You're good at this, he said softly, his voice carrying an edge I couldn't place. I didn't know whether to feel proud or ashamed. As the game went on, the questions became more personal, more invasive, and the tasks more daring. Each card was a step deeper into a labyrinth I didn't know how to escape from. Do you trust me? He asked at one point, leaning forward, his eyes locked on mine. I hesitated. The word caught in my throat, tangled in a web of fear and fascination. I don't know. He smiled, his expression softening ever so slightly. Good. Honesty is important. His approval felt like a reward, and I hated that it did. But I couldn't deny the strange pull I felt, like a moth drawn to a flame it knew would consume it. The next card asked me to reveal a regret. A real regret. My chest tightened as I thought about what to say. There were so many things I could choose from, but none of them felt safe. I was running out of things to hide behind. You're overthinking it, he said, his voice low and soothing. Just let it out. I hated how easy he made it sound, hated how much I wanted to prove I could handle this, that I wasn't afraid. I told him about the time I betrayed a friend, how I carried the guilt even now. Interesting, he said, leaning back in his chair. You're more complicated than you let on. His words felt like an accusation and a compliment all at once. At some point, the air in the room shifted. The tension between us, which had been simmering under the surface, began to boil over. I could feel it in the way he looked at me, in the deliberate way he moved, as if every step, every word, was part of a larger plan. The next card was a task. Let me choose your next move, it read. My heart skipped a beat as I placed the card on the table. What does that mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached across the table and took my hand in his touch firm yet gentle. It means you trust me, he said simply. I wanted to pull away, to break the spell he was weaving, but I couldn't. I felt trapped, not by his hand, but by my own curiosity. What would he do next? He stood, still holding my hand, and pulled me to my feet. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if giving me time to back out. But I didn't. I'm not going to hurt you, he said, his voice low and steady. I just want to show you something. He led me to the window, where the moonlight spilled into the room, casting long shadows across the floor. Look out there, he said, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. I followed his gaze, my breath catching in my throat as I took in the view. The world outside seemed so distant, so unreal, compared to the intensity of the moment. This is what freedom feels like, he said softly. The ability to take risks, to push yourself beyond what you thought was possible. I turned to look at him, my heart pounding in my chest. What are you trying to prove? Nothing, he said, his eyes meeting mine. I just want you to see what you're capable of. The game continued, but it was no longer about the cards. It was about us, about the unspoken tension that had been building with every question, every challenge. The next task was simple on the surface. Share something you've never told anyone. I hesitated, my mind racing. There were so many things I could say, but each one felt like a step too far. You can trust me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And in that moment, I believed him. I told him about the time I ran away from home, how I spent hours wandering the streets, hoping someone would notice I was gone. How I felt invisible, even to myself. I'm not invisible anymore, I added, my voice trembling. No, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. You're not. The line between the game and reality blurred until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The cards were forgotten, the rules irrelevant. It was just us now, caught in the web of emotions I didn't know how to untangle. He reached for my hand again, his touch sending a shiver down my spine. You're stronger than you think, he said, his voice filled with something I couldn't name. Am I? I asked, my voice barely audible. He smiled, that same enigmatic smile that had drawn me in from the start. You're still here, aren't you? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because he was right. I was still there. And part of me didn't want to leave. If you thought this was intense, just wait. What happened next was something I'll never forget. It changed everything, forever. Richard had a way of making every challenge feel like a test of character. The rules, once simple, became labyrinthine, weaving a complex web that was impossible to navigate without stepping into something deeper, darker. Each task was designed to push me, to strip away layers of resistance until I was left raw, exposed. One evening, as we sat across from each other, the silence between us thickened. The last card I'd drawn had left my cheeks burning, the question so personal I could barely whisper the answer. My hands trembled as I placed it back on the table, my resolve cracking. We need to stop, I said, my voice shaky but firm. This has gone too far. Richard leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. Then stop, he said simply. But you'll lose. His words sliced through me. Lose? Lose what? This wasn't a competition, was it? That's not fair, I shot back, my voice laced with frustration. Life isn't fair, Adele, he said, his tone calm, almost kind. But giving up? That's not your style. Or have I misjudged you? It was a challenge, clear as day. And I hated how much I wanted to prove him wrong. You haven't, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. That night, he introduced something new. The cards were still there, but they no longer held the same weight. Instead of answering questions, I had to act. Each task was a performance, each movement carefully observed. Actions speak louder than words, he said, sliding a card across the table toward me. Don't you agree? I hesitated, staring at the card as if it might bite me. Finally, I flipped it over. It was simple on the surface, take control. What does that even mean? I asked, my voice wavering. It means what you make it mean, he replied, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't quite place. The ambiguity was maddening. I stood, my heart pounding, and walked to the edge of the room, as if distance might offer clarity. It didn't. I turned to face him, the weight of his gaze pinning me in place. Well, he prompted, his voice soft but insistent. I clenched my fists, trying to steady myself. Fine, I said, crossing the room back to him. My mind raced, searching for something, anything, that would fulfill the task without giving too much away. I reached for his glass of wine, taking it from his hand with a deliberate motion. I raised it to my lips, meeting his gaze as I drank. The bitterness burned my throat, but I didn't flinch. Interesting choice, he said, his smile widening. The tension in the room was suffocating, but I refused to look away. I'd completed the task, but at what cost? As the evening wore on, the tasks became more invasive, more intimate. Each one forced me to confront parts of myself I'd kept buried, to expose vulnerabilities I wasn't ready to share. Touch your fear, one card read. What does that even mean? I asked, my voice rising in frustration. You tell me, he said, his calm demeanor infuriating. I wanted to walk away, to throw the cards across the room and end this charade. But instead, I closed my eyes and placed a hand over my heart, feeling the rapid thud beneath my palm. This, I said quietly. This is my fear. When I opened my eyes, his expression had softened, but the intensity in his gaze remained. You're braver than you think, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The tasks continued, each one blurring the line between a game and something far more dangerous. One card instructed me to step closer to him, another to hold his gaze without flinching. By the time we reached the final card of the night, I was emotionally drained, my walls crumbling. Let me guide you, it read. I stared at the words, my stomach twisting into knots. What does that mean? I asked again, though I already knew the answer. It means you trust me, he said, standing and extending his hand toward me. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to run. But instead, I took his hand. His grip was firm, reassuring, and I hated how much I craved that reassurance. He led me to the center of the room, the dim light casting shadows across the walls. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if giving me time to back out. Close your eyes, he said softly. Why? Do you trust me or not? I closed my eyes, my breath hitching as I felt his hand on my shoulder. For a moment, everything else faded away, the room, the rules, the fear. It was just us, suspended in a moment that felt both infinite and fleeting. Good, he murmured. When I opened my eyes, the world around me seemed sharper, more vivid. The game had shifted again, and I wasn't sure if I was a participant or a pawn. You're doing well, Richard said, his voice laced with something that sounded like pride. But the real test is still to come. What test? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the deck of cards and began shuffling them, his movements hypnotic. Are you ready? He asked, his eyes meeting mine. I wanted to say no, to tell him I'd had enough. But instead, I nodded. Good, he said, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. Then let's continue. By now, the game was no longer about the cards. It was about us, about the unspoken tension that had been building with every question, every task. "Do you know why you're still here?" he asked at one point, his voice low, almost tender. I shook my head, unable to form the words. "Because you want to be," he said simply. His words hit me like a jolt, both terrifying and thrilling. Was he right? Did I want this? I didn't know. All I knew was that I couldn't leave. The game had transformed into something much bigger than a game. It consumed me, wrapped itself around my mind, and refused to let go. Each move, each word from Richard pulled me deeper into a place I wasn't sure I wanted to be, but couldn't resist exploring. "You know, this isn't about the rules anymore," Richard said one evening, his voice soft but charged. "It's about trust. About how far you're willing to go to find it." His words lingered, hanging heavy in the air between us. Trust. It sounded so simple, but in that moment, it felt like the most complicated thing in the world. I couldn't shake the feeling that he saw straight through me, into every hidden corner of my soul. The tasks became riskier, more demanding, each one stripping away another layer of my defenses. He never rushed me, never pressured me outright. It was his calm, his patience, that made it impossible to say no. One night, the tension between us reached a breaking point. I had just completed a particularly revealing task, and I could feel the heat of his gaze as I sat back down, my chest heaving. "Come here," he said quietly, his tone more an invitation than a command. I hesitated, my heart pounding as I stood and walked toward him. When I was close enough to feel his breath on my skin, he leaned in, his voice a low whisper. "You'll never feel free unless you're willing to risk losing everything." His words ignited something inside me, a fire I couldn't control. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew he was right. From that point on, everything changed. The tasks were no longer just exercises in vulnerability. They became something much more intimate, much more dangerous. One evening, he handed me a card that simply said, "Surrender." "What does this mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It means you stop trying to control everything," he replied, his eyes locking onto mine. I stared at the card, my hands trembling. Control had always been my armor, my shield against the world. Giving it up felt like stepping off a cliff with no guarantee of a landing. "I don't know if I can do this," I admitted, my voice breaking. "You can," he said softly. "And you will." The line between the game and reality blurred until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. It wasn't just about completing the tasks anymore, it was about the way he watched me, the way he seemed to anticipate my every move. The next challenge required me to share my deepest desire, something I'd never spoken aloud, not even to myself. "You already know," I said, my voice trembling. "Say it anyway," he urged, his tone gentle but firm. I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. But the longer I stayed silent, the more I realized I had no choice. "I want to feel seen," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "I want to feel like I matter." "You do," he said, his words cutting through me like a blade. The intimacy of the game became suffocating, yet addictive. Each task pushed me closer to the edge, until I wasn't sure where the edge even was anymore. One night, he handed me a card that read, "Trust me." "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It means you let me lead," he said simply. I wanted to refuse, to walk away, but I couldn't. I nodded, my breath hitching as he stood and reached for my hand. He led me to the window, where the moonlight bathed the room in a soft, ethereal glow. "Do you know why I chose you for this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "Because you're stronger than you think," he replied. His words stayed with me long after the game ended that night. They played over and over in my mind, each repetition pulling me deeper into the web he'd woven around us. The next evening, the tasks took another turn. This time, they weren't about me, they were about us. "Show me what you're afraid of," one card read. I hesitated, my heart racing as I looked at him. "I'm afraid of losing control," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "Then let go," he said simply. I wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't that easy, but I couldn't. Because he was right. By now, I wasn't just playing the game, I was living it. Every thought, every action was tied to Richard, to the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel. It was intoxicating, terrifying, and I couldn't stop. "Do you know what's next?" he asked one night, his voice soft but charged. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "Good," he replied, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Because neither do I." It was the truth, and that terrified me more than anything else. We were both walking a line neither of us could see, and there was no turning back. I don't know the exact moment it stopped being a game, but when his hand reached out and gripped my shoulders, reality blurred into something unrecognizable. We crossed a line I never imagined we would. That night was different. The tension, which had been simmering between us for weeks, finally boiled over. Richard sat beside me, close enough that the air between us felt electric. His hand brushed against mine, and that single touch sent a spark through me. It was subtle, almost accidental, but it was the final crack in the fragile barrier I'd tried so hard to keep intact. "We've come so far, Adele. Do you want to stop now?" His voice was calm, measured, but there was something deeper in his tone, a challenge, an invitation. I turned to look at him, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Words failed me. All I could do was nod. His movements were deliberate, slow, as if giving me one last chance to back out. But I didn't. His hands slid into my hair, his touch careful, almost reverent. Our faces were so close that I could feel the warmth of his breath, and then it happened. The line we'd danced around for so long was gone, obliterated in a moment that felt both infinite and fleeting. I couldn't think, couldn't rationalize what was happening. There was no right or wrong, no past or future. There was only him, and the way he made the world fade to black. When it was over, I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling as my breathing slowly steadied. Richard sat at the other end, his head tilted back, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. I didn't feel guilt. Not yet. Instead, there was a strange exhilaration coursing through me, a mix of relief, rebellion, and something I couldn't quite name. "We can't go back now," Richard said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, almost reflective, as if he were speaking more to himself than to me. I turned my head to look at him. He wasn't smiling, but his expression wasn't regretful either. He looked at me like I was a puzzle he had finally solved, but the answer only raised more questions. "No," I agreed, my voice barely audible. "We can't." The next morning, I woke to the sound of the door creaking open. Groggy and disoriented, I blinked against the harsh morning light. And then I saw her. My mother stood in the doorway, her face pale with fury, her eyes blazing. The sight of her hit me like a freight train, and suddenly, all the exhilaration of the night before evaporated, replaced by a sinking dread. "You thought I wouldn't notice?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. I froze, my mind scrambling for something to say, but there was nothing. No explanation, no excuse that could make this better. Her gaze shifted from me to Richard, who stood frozen in the kitchen doorway. Her lips curled into a sneer, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. "Get out," she spat, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. Richard hesitated, but only for a moment. He grabbed his keys from the counter and left without a word, the door slamming shut behind him. And then she turned back to me. "You betrayed me," she said, her voice cold and flat. The weight of her words crushed me, and for the first time, I felt the full force of what I'd done. That afternoon, I received a message from Richard. "We'll figure this out," it read. But as I stared at the words on my phone, I couldn't decide if I wanted to believe him. Later that evening, I found the box, the one that had started it all, sitting by the trash bin outside. The cards inside were torn to shreds, their fragments spilling out like the pieces of my shattered reality. One card caught my eye. Its edge was jagged, but the words on the back were still legible. This wasn't a game. It was a test. "And you failed." I stared at it for what felt like an eternity. My hands trembled as I clutched the ruined card, my mind spinning with anger, confusion, and a bitterness I couldn't shake. But I didn't cry. Instead, I smiled, a small, defiant smile that surprised even me. "I don't need your rules anymore," I whispered, letting the card slip from my fingers to join the rest in the trash. That night, as I sat alone in my room, my mother's final words echoed in my mind. "Now you'll live with the consequences." The weight of her voice, of her cold, unyielding gaze, stayed with me long after the house fell silent. I didn't know what would happen next. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same.